Okay, good morning, everybody. I don't want to be mean-spirited. I actually don't like the head thing, so I'm a little happy today. But I hope I'll try to talk a little bit louder. Yeah. So first, just want to announce our sponsorship today. This shir is sponsored for the entire year by Rav Rafael and Sharon Auman in memory of their parents Edith and Rainer Auman, Zichronum Livracha, and their son Harav Shmuel Eliyahu Auman, Kulam Zichronum Livracha. Once again, we're very, very grateful for their Hachzakas Torah. May it be a zechut for the Niftarim and for all of their family. We've been talking a lot about the counting of the Omer, and I hope everyone had a wonderful Lag BaOmer. I want to continue because, again, the overall unit is actually the mitzvot that are connected to Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we've kind of gotten to the Omer. I want to talk today about the Omer itself. What is the Omer itself? We're so used to thinking Omer is a period of time, when in fact Omer is a volume. It's a volume measurement. So the halacha is, the Torah says in Parshat Emor, we just read it the Shabbos before last Shabbos, that on the second day of Pesach, we bring what is called a Korban Omer. That means a measure of barley flour, very coarsely ground. The measure is an Omer. An Omer is the amount of man that fell every day, and it happens to be the volume of 43 1/5 eggs. Eggs. That's the volume. That also happens to be the amount of flour which obligates you to separate challah. Now, as you know, if you separate challah, there's a great deal of uncertainty if the size of eggs have changed in the course of time. So in terms of a weight measure, which is not really totally accurate because technically it's a volume, not a weight, but often, just for ease, it's defined as weight. This would be between 2.5 pounds of flour or 5 pounds of flour. And in terms of cups of flour, which is a volume, it could be anywhere between 6 and 12 cups. So I'm not here to decide what is the size of the requisite egg, but be it as it may, this is the measure. 43 1/5 eggs of coarsely ground barley flour was brought as a mincha. Mincha just means a meal offering in the Beit HaMikdash. Like most menachot, the Kohen did kmitza. That means, I'm using the wrong hand, he did it with his right hand. He took 3 fingers of the flour and sacrificed it on the altar. Right, the kmitza is burnt on the Mizbeach. The shirayim, so shirayim was not invented by Chassidut, the shirayim mincha, the leftover mincha, which is most of it, was baked as matzah, and it would be eaten by the Kohanim, barley matzah. It would have to be eaten Yom V'Layla. So if it was brought the second day of Pesach, they'd have that day and they would have that night to be able to eat it. This is called the Korban HaOmer, the Korban of the volume of the Omer. It is Sa'orim. And it had, and in fact, if you recall, that's the basis of the discussion, whether the counting of the Omer is d'oraisa today, because most Rishonim, like Tosfos, say that the mitzvah of counting SEFIRA is talui on Korban HaOmer. Therefore, if we don't have Korban HaOmer, it is the shita of Tosfos that SEFIRA is only midrabanan zecher lemikdash, except the Rambam says, SEFIRA is independent of that. Okay, be it as it may. But what I want to talk about today is something that's people pay a little less attention to, and that is the Omer, the Hakravas HaOmer, the bringing of the Omer is not just a mitzvah in and of itself, but it provides a very important matter. It permits something that was otherwise prohibited until the Omer is brought. And that is the halacha of CHODOSH. New grain. Now this only applies to the chameshet minei dagan. It does not apply to fruit or vegetables or buckwheat or quinoa. But the 5 grains, that's chita, saora, right? That's wheat, barley, rye, oats, spelt, right? Those 5 minei dagan, which are the ones that you make mazonos on and you make hamotzi on, and that can become chametz, right? All of these different, and that are chayiv and challah, all of these things are correlated. You are not allowed to eat what is called new grain. I'll define that term in a moment. Until the Omer is brought. Until the Omer is brought, you only eat old grain, grain from the prior year, not grain from the new year. In other words, this is called the Iyar of Chadash, and sometimes we refer to it conversely. Until the Omer, you're only allowed to eat Yashan. You're not allowed to eat Chadash. Now, obviously, it's critical to know what defines something as Chadash and what defines something as Yashan, because obviously all Chadash, just like everybody young, will hopefully become old, so eventually all new grain becomes old grain. What is the definition of Chadash and Yashan? So the Gemara in Menachos has a very interesting definition that's not intuitive necessarily. It actually says that even if the grain grew after Pesach and was harvested after Pesach, as long as it was planted before Pesach and took root before Pesach, that's called hashrasha. As long as it had hashrasha before Pesach, when the Omer comes, it then becomes mutter, meaning to say, anything that is nishrash after Pesach is called chadash until next year's Omer. So, to take it very simple, as a general rule, how much time elapses between planting and rooting is a question. It may be anywhere between a week or 2 weeks. There are different shiurim. But let's just go with planting. I'm going to just, for simplicity, I'm going to treat planting as equivalent to rooting, assuming you have to wait X number of days. If something is planted before Pesach, the Omer will mature it. So even though it grew after Pesach and was harvested after Pesach, it is not considered new, it is considered to be old. If, on the other hand, it was planted after the second day of Pesach, meaning after the Omer, then it's considered to be new grain, and you would not be allowed to eat it until next year's Omer, after which, of course, the Chadash becomes the Yashan. So this is the very, very important key idea, that the Omer matirs, the Omer permits anything that was nishrash before the Hakravas HaOmer, but anything that is nishrash after Hakravas HaOmer is not going to be permitted till next year. Now, point number one here is the fact.
The same situation about that year.
Yeah, every year it'll be the same thing. In other words, anything that's nishrash after this year's Omer is nishrash before next year's Omer. So so therefore it's going to be, in other words, the point is this: to mature it this year, the grain already has to be nishrash. If it was nishrash after this year's Omer, then it'll have to be mutter next year, because next year it's nishrash before next year's Omer, right? That's what I'm saying, that everything eventually gets mutter, but sometimes you have to wait as long as a year. Now, today we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. Because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the Korban Omer. So you might ask the obvious question, if you're not allowed to eat grain until you bring the Korban Omer, and today we don't bring the Korban Omer, so how are we allowed to ever eat the Chadash? What matters the Chadash? There's nothing that matters the Chadash. So the Gemara comes to the rescue here, and the Gemara, through a number of drashos, basically says there is a 2-tiered system in maturing the Chadash. Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, when there's a Beis HaMikdash, it is the actual bringing of the Omer that matures the Chadash. You cannot eat the new grain, as defined, until the Omer is actually brought. However, when there's no Beis HaMikdash, it is the day that matters, meaning Iyar HaMizrach. Iyar HaMizrach is equivalent to dawn. That's when you have your first light in the east, even before nates, even before sunrise. And the halacha is on the 16th of Nisan, Chadash is mutter amud hashachar. Now that's the oraisa, which means the following. When there is a Beis HaMikdash and they don't get around to bringing the Omer till 12 noon, you wouldn't be allowed to eat Chadash until 12 noon. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, you're actually allowed to eat it dawn of the 16th. Now, once again, we apply the same paradigm. Any grain that was nishrash before the 16th of Nisan will become mutter, amud hashachar of the 16th. Anything that was nishrash after the 16th of Nisan cannot be eaten until next 16th of Nisan. So these are the two dates, or the two events. Hakravas ha'omer bizman hamikdash, Iyar hamizrach shelo bizman hamikdash. Now, we then come to a final little adjustment, and this was one of the takanot of the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, was a very, very pivotal figure. He lived at the very time of the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, and he was the one that kind of took us through that very, very difficult period. If you remember, he actually met with the emperor. Well, he met with Vespasian, who was a general who was going to become emperor, and he tried to negotiate something, and he managed to get 3 concessions that Yavne v'Chachameh, that Yavne was set aside as a center for the Chachmei TORAH to come together. In addition, he asked that Rabban Gamliel's family be spared because they were the Nisiim, the hereditary Nisiim from Hillel and ultimately from David HaMelech. And the third was more of a private request, and there was a great, great, great tzaddik, Rav Tzadok, who had fasted 40 years. I mean, he ate a little bit at night. He had fasted 40 years to avert the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. As a result, his health was not very good, and therefore he requested special medical treatment for Rav Tzadok. Now, the Gemara itself discusses, and it's still a matter of controversy, if Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai had the right to ask for anything, why did he not ask for the Beis HaMikdash itself and the sparing of Jerusalem, which was destroyed? And there's actually a discussion. According to one opinion, he goofed, he messed up, meaning at a time of great, great, great stress, sometimes even the greatest chachamim can lose their perspective. That's one view. According to the other view, he did the best that he could because of the principle tafasta meruba like tafasta, meaning he was afraid if he asked for too much, he would get nothing at all. And again, this is often the agonizing situation that leaders find themselves in, whether you're a religious leader or a political leader. How much do you push? How much do you ask for? How much do you demand? Because there's always going to be that danger that you come to a breaking point and then you lose everything. On the other hand, sometimes you ask for too little or you demand too little, and as a result, you didn't accomplish what you could accomplish. So I would be very reluctant. I think none of us should sit in judgment on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was dealing with an excruciatingly difficult situation. But he was the great, great leader of the Jewish people during that very tumultuous time. And the Gemara records he made a number of takanot. There are a number of takanot that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made. And one of these takanot may sound very minor, but it is a halachic rule. That is, he was mitaken that Chodosh is not, when there's no temple, Chadash is not mutter on the 16th of Nisan, but you got to wait until the morning of the 17th of Nisan. He added one day. And the reason is very simple. And the reason itself is quite beautiful, because the following. He says like this: if we get into the habit of eating Chadash the morning of the 16th, what happens next year when the temple gets rebuilt, as we surely hope it will? So we're going to get up early in the morning on the 16th, eat the new grain, but the problem is you're not allowed to do that till they bring the Omer, which might be 12 noon or whatever it would be. So, Mehera Yibana HaMikdash, he says, we're not going to allow people to eat the morning of the 16th. lest they get into that bad habit when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. And we certainly believe Meheira Yibana HaMikdash. You have to understand something. You have to understand that although this takana is a very technical takana, and it simply pushes off the heter of eating Chadash by one day. That's all it does. Instead of the 16th, you got to wait till the 17th. But you have to understand the confidence building and the hope that he's inspiring with this. He's telling Yidden right after the Korban. He says, don't eat your Chadash the morning of the 16th, because we have to have emunah that the Beis HaMikdash might be rebuilt next year. And if it's going to be rebuilt next year, you're not going to be able to eat on the 16th. So defer it by a day. So for sure that's going to be after the Omer, as late as they bring the Omer. Because, the very year the temple is built, we might be in a rush. Meaning, let's say the Beis HaMikdash comes Erev Yom Tov or whatever it would be. So they might bring it very late on the 16th. So wait until the 17th. So you have to understand that sometimes the most technical arcane takana is a way of keeping hope alive in the Jewish soul. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saw one of his missions to inculcate the idea Meheira Yibana HaMikdash, that we believe the Beis HaMikdash can come back at any time. Of course, there's always like a double-edged sword to that, meaning some would make the argument, well, wait a second, if you start encouraging people that the Beis HaMikdash can come, tomorrow or next year, what's going to happen when it doesn't? Does that deflate their hope? Does that destroy their hope? Right. So that's an interesting question that, again, Judaism has grappled with for many, many centuries. The notion of holding out the imminence of Mashiach, as opposed to simply saying he'll come when he comes, and we don't necessarily talk about imminence. They tell him, with Yaakov Kamenetsky, when he was a Rav in Toronto, an interesting story. There was a storekeeper who was a Yid who was, his store was open on Shabbos. But he had a very Jewish heart. He was a European Jew, and, he believed in all the Midrashim and all of the Chazals about things. So somebody said to him, Mashiach can come tomorrow. And what is it going to look like if you're a Mechalel Shabbos and you have your store open and Mashiach comes tomorrow? Aren't you going to be ashamed? Aren't you going to be embarrassed? Aren't you going to really, really wish you weren't in that situation? Now, this type of speech very, very much appealed to this man's sensibility. And he was prepared to totally close his store, because Mashiach will come, Thursday or whatever, Sunday. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, you go back to the guy immediately and you tell him, we believe in Mashiach, but we have no idea when he's coming. So the person said to Rav Yaakov, what do you mean? I tell the guy that, he's going to keep his store open. He says, you tell the guy, Mashiach is coming, tomorrow, therefore you better shut down your store. Well, what happens if Mashiach doesn't come tomorrow? How is the guy going to feel? You lied to him, you cheated him, you deceived him. What is his attitude going to be towards rabbis and towards Judaism when they make these claims that don't materialize? He says it is better to be honest. It is better to be open, even though in the short run you might accomplish more by kind of these tactics of telling him, Mashiach is coming tomorrow. And Rav Yaakov basically said that you can't just look at the short-term gain that you might get by painting certain pictures. You have to be committed to emes, because in the long run, if people are lied to, if people are deceived, they're going to simply walk away with a great deal of bitterness. So that was Rav Yaakov's philosophy, that even if the guy would go back to keeping his store open on Shabbos, that would have been better than to lie to him by promising something that was not going to happen. Okay, so we now have these two levels. Once again, we have the rule that Bisman HaMikdash, the Chadash is permitted only with the Omer offering itself. And then we have the rule that when it's not a Beis HaMikdash, the Oraisa, it's mutter at dawn of the 16th. And the Takana of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai says you got to wait until dawn of the 17th. And this is called Chadash, and it only applies to the 5 grains. Now, I'm now going to discuss very briefly Does it apply in chutz la'aretz, and does it apply to the produce of goyim? This is very, very important. In Eretz Yisrael, and if the grain was grown by a Jewish farmer, two things, Jewish farmer in Eretz Yisrael, there is absolutely no question that there is an Isser of Chadash. And you cannot eat Chadash until the morning of the 17th of Nisan. So, how do you know? The answer is, you don't have to know anything. This is handled by hashkachas. Every single hashkacha in Eretz Yisrael, mahadrin, non-mahadrin, whatever it would be, if it's a legitimate hashkacha, will ensure that no grain reaches the market until it is already in a state of yashan. You don't have to investigate it. The chadash is held back, meaning... Now, keep in mind, if you think about this, after Pesach, right now, there is no possibility of any grain being chadash. Because any grain you see must have been rooted at least before Pesach, actually a long time before Pesach. So after Pesach, for a few months, everything is yashan. Right? No problem at all. Where you begin to get problems is towards the end of the summer, approaching Yomim Noraim, and certainly after Sukkot, where grain can already have been planted after Pesach, and as a result, it would be Chadash until next Omer, or the next 17th of Nisan. So right now, even if you're very machmer on Chadash, you can breathe easy. You don't have a problem. But as I say, every hashkacha, even a rabbanut non-mahadrin hashkacha, will not allow anything that is halachically chadash to be put on the markets, so you don't have to check for chadash or yashan. Now, this is in Eretz Yisrael. What about chutz la'aretz? So this is a huge machlokas. There's a famous psak of the Ram. It's machlokas. It's a machlokas in the Gemara. Ultimately, does chadash apply? Because we know that most mitzvot tuluyot bi'aretz, most mitzvot that are connected with agriculture, only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Truma, Maser, Shemitah, they don't apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. So one might have thought Chadash is connected to grain, connected to agriculture. It should not apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. And yet, there is an opinion that says that since in Parshas Emor, when it describes the issue of not eating the new grain, it uses the words B'chol moshvotechem, wherever you live. Some say that does apply to Chutz La'aretz. Some say it just means wherever you live in Eretz Yisrael. So there's a machlokas in the Gemara. Does the Yisur of Chadash apply to Chutz La'aretz grain? Most poskim actually say it does. Now, here is the issue, however. The Ramah, the great posek of Ashkenazic Jewry, and by the way, the Ramah's yahrzeit, you may know, was on Lag BaOmer. It was on Lag BaOmer itself. The Ramah died very amazingly, tragically young. The Ramah died, I believe, it was 46, certainly in his 40s, and just amazing what he was able to accomplish. But the Ramah has a famous psak in Yoredeya that in Chutz La'aretz we are allowed to eat all grain without checking if it is Chadash or Yashan. And he bases this on a problematical application of a principle called double doubt, Sveik Sveika. He says, if I have given grain, so here's the thing. First of all, maybe the grain was harvested from the old year. And even if it was harvested this year, maybe it was nishrash before Pesach. So therefore I have a double doubt. The Ramah matters. I don't want to get into the lumdus too much. This is a very difficult double doubt because it's really one doubt. Is it Chadash or is it Yashan? I mean, it could be Yashan because it was harvested in the old year, or it could be Yashan because it was Nishrash before Pesach. That's not two doubts. It's the same principle. is it Chadash or Yashan? But the Ramah makes it a Sveka, which means, according to the Ramah, if you're a farmer and you know your grain, or the grain of the guy that you're buying, is Chadash, you wouldn't be allowed to eat it. But in market, I can go with what is called Sveka. So, in truth, many mainstream American hashgachos, and I believe this included, I know this did include the OU, I don't know if they changed their policy. My guess is they didn't, but I don't want to say for sure. But historically, the OU has not certified for Chadash and Yashan in Chutz La'aretz because they simply paskind that they'll follow the Ramah's view, who matirs these grains, unless you know for sure what they are. So as a result, hashgachas like the OU you did not have any hechsher on Chodosh or Yashan because they were somech on the Ramah. The Star K, on the other hand, in Baltimore, and the more maybe yeshiva hashgachos, and as well as the OK, which was kind of Chabad, Rav Dov Ber Levi was a Chabad person, they were machmir, and they would only certify grain that was Yashan. Now, what happened is that for many, many years in America, very, very few people cared about Chadash or Yashan. They were simply going with the flow. But in recent decades, some of it was actually the influence of the Soloveitchik family. Actually, more Rav Aaron Soloveitchik than Rav Yosef Dov. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik was very, very, very makbid on the din of Chadash, and this raised the consciousness of many B'nai Torah, B'nai Yeshiva, and the like. So as a result, there is now a cottage industry of trying to identify which grain products, and this includes a lot of things. This includes bread, pasta, cookies, all sorts of stuff, which is Yashan, which is Chadash, and they look at product codes, and they look at these labels, and they have directories, and then some people who are makbid, after Pesach, they buy a year's worth of spaghetti and cookies and the like, because they know that that's Yashan, and they want to do it, that they want to carry them through till next Pesach. But of course you got a problem because these people tend not to sell chametz, so you got a little bit of an issue, because all of that chametz that they want to use for after Pesach, they're not going to be somech on mechiras chametz. So this is where two chumras can kill you. Meaning you're makbid on Chadash, and you're not somech on mechiras chametz. That's going to create a big problem. But there's even in Lakewood, there's even a Chadash directory that kind of lists which products you can get at different times of years. So again, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I mean, in Eretz Yisrael, you for sure have to keep the laws of Chadash, and you don't have to worry about it because it is built in automatically in every hashgacha. So there's nothing I'm saying that should upset you in any way. Keep on buying your grain products. You don't have any problem. But in Chutz La'aretz, there are going to be issues. One has to determine whether they want to be properly machmer on the din of Chadash, or whether they will be somech on the Ramah, who matirs Chadash because of Sveik.
What about imported grain?
Oh, okay. So imported grain is not a problem either. Meaning it has to grow. It has to grow here. It's imported grain will be the same problem as Chutz La'aretz itself, which will be the machlokas.
Which would be the problem?
Yeah, the Rabbanut is not certifying. So even if something has a Rabbanut hashgacha, they are not certifying that the grain product is Yashan. They only certify Israeli produce as Yashan. Right? So this is just a little bit to understand that the Omer has a very important matir function. It permits not just a separate mitzvah in and of itself. So now let me raise a very interesting question. This is a question from Nach. Yoshua, right, takes over after Moshe Rabbeinu dies, and the Jewish people miraculously cross the Yarden River. Remember, the Yarden River splits, just like the Yam Suf. And this was on the 10th of Nisan. On the 10th of Nisan. This is recorded in Sefer Yoshua on the 10th of Nisan. So Pesach is coming up pretty soon. And they're going to bring their first Korban Pesach in Eretz Yisrael. And indeed, It is the first Korban Pesach in 40 years. They only brought one Korban. They brought a Korban Pesach in Egypt, and then they brought one Korban Pesach the first year in the Midbar. There was no Korban Pesach for the other 40 years. This is the first one. Indeed, all of the Jews that were born in the desert did not even have, or the men did not even have Brit Milah. So the book of Yoshua records that one of the great hachanot that had to be made before they could bring the Korban Pesach was all of the hundreds of thousands of males had to be circumcised, because if a person is an Arel, they're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. So again, in the book of Yoshua, it is described the mass bris milah of all of the people, because it says, Mulim hayu kol laham hayotzim. All of the men who left Mitzrayim had Brit Milah. Of course, most of them died in the desert, if they were 20 and up. But the people that were born in the desert did not have a Brit Milah, and therefore they had a Brit Milah. And then they brought the Korban Pesach. Okay, that was a wonderful thing. The first Korban Pesach in 40 years, the first Korban Pesach in Eretz Yisrael. And then it mentions, and they ate from the grain of the land, mimacharat ha-Pesach. The day after Pesach, they ate. Now, first of all, phrases which the Torah itself uses, mimacharat ha-Pesach. So little, what day is that? It's a little unclear. What does Pesach mean? Pesach can have two meanings in Tanakh. It can mean the day of the Korban Pesach, which is the 14th of Nisan, or it could mean the day of the holiday of Pesach, which in the Torah is not even called holiday of Pesach. It's called Chag HaMatzos, which is the 15th. If Pesach means the 14th, Mimacharas HaPesach is the 15th. If Pesach means the 15th, Mimacharas HaPesach is the 16th. Now, in Parshas Masai, the end of Bamidbar, which lists the different Masaot, the different stops of the Jewish people, so it starts off the list by saying, Mimacharas HaPesach Yatsu B'nei Yisrael. The Jewish people left Mitzrayim Mimacharas, the day after Pesach. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, they left on the 15th. So if you're calling the 15th Mimacharas HaPesach, then Pesach must refer to the 14th. But in Sefer Yehoshua, it's exactly the opposite. It says they did not eat the new grain of Eretz Yisrael until Mimacharas HaPesach. Now the Gemara explains that when they come to Eretz Yisrael, all of that grain is Chadash to them, because no Omer was brought. So they weren't permitted to eat that grain until the 16th, when they brought the Omer offering. So you see there's a contradiction. In Parshas Masai, Pesach means 14th, and Mimacharas is 15th. In Sefer Yoshua, Pesach must mean 15, because Macharas HaPesach is 16. So Tosas in Rosh Hashanah brings that this was a question that I believe, I don't want to say for sure, that this is the only time in Shas that the Eben Ezra is quoted in a Tosfos. This was a kasha of Avram Eben Ezra asked Rabbeinu Tam. We wouldn't realize that they knew each other. They met each other. The Eben Ezra, who of course was very much into diktuk and the meanings of words, asked Rabbeinu Tam that there's a contradiction between Parshas Masai and Sefer Yehoshua as to what is the reference of Pesach, Yudalit, the day of Korban Pesach, or Tesvav. And Rabbeinu Tam kind of gave a dochik answer. He said, Lashon Torah l'chud, Lashon Nevi'im l'chud. Meaning to say, the Torah uses words in a certain way, and the prophets may use words in a different way. And therefore, the fact that there's inconsistency in usage is not necessarily such a question. Okay. But be it as it may, The Gemara's understanding of the pasuk in Yoshua that they didn't eat from the grain till Mimacharas HaPesach actually means that they were living on man or whatever it is. In fact, even after Moshe died, the man remained. Normally it didn't last more than a night, but it remained so they could eat the man. And on the 16th of Nisan, second day of Pesach, they brought the Omer offering, and then they ate. So based on this, the Gemara raises, the Talmud Yerushalmi raises a very surprising question. The night of the 15th of Nisan, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. Now, the night of the 15th is one day before the 16th. So in a regular year where we had brought the Omer last year, we would have Yashan to eat. But we didn't bring an Omer offering. You don't bring the Omer until it comes out to sell. So it turns out there was absolutely no grain we were allowed to eat. If there was no grain we were allowed to eat, how did we fulfill the mitzvah of matzah the first night of Pesach? All matzah would have been Chadash, which did not have an Omer to matter, because this is the first Omer offering that we're bringing. So the Talmud Yerushalmi says, quite surprisingly, they did not eat matzah that year. They ate the Korban Pesach, they ate the Maror, they did everything else. I don't know if they did 4 cups of wine then, but they did every other thing they could do, but they could not eat matzah. They were mevatel, the mitzvah of matzah, because of the Yisur of Chadash.
What about non-Jewish farmers? They weren't farmers then.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So this is one of the rayas. The Yerushalmi apparently, this is actually one of the proofs, the Yerushalmi apparently takes the view that the Yisur of Chadash applies even to non-Jewish grain. Because after all, the grain that they found when they came to Eretz Yisrael was all grown under the non-Jewish ownership. So this would be a raya that Chadash does apply even in the grain of non-Jews. Again, I don't mean a non-Jew doesn't have the prohibition, but I mean I as a Jew cannot eat the Chadash grown by a non-Jew. So the Yerushalmi then asks the kasha that we have a general principle in halacha called aseh docha lo sasa. What does that mean? When you have a conflict between a positive commandment, thou shalt do, and the only way I can do the positive is by transgressing a negative, thou shalt not. So what do? So the halacha is actually the positive, think positive, right? The positive overrides the negative. This is a famous principle, although it's a quite complex principle in application. This is called aseh docha lo sasa. A positive commandment pushes aside a negative commandment. The most common example that we would face is a brit on Shabbos. Right? Bris Milah, we know if it's the 8th day of birth, we do it on Shabbos. Even though every bris is a desecration of Shabbos. You're causing bleeding and the like. But there's no other way I can do the mitzvah on Shabbos other than by violating Shabbos. So the positive overrides the negative. This is also the explanation of why, as we mentioned this, when I do a bris late, if I'm doing a bris on the 9th day or the 10th day or later, I'm not allowed to do it on Shabbos, simply because there is a mitzvah to do a bris, but there's no special mitzvah to do it on day 9 or day 10. So if day 9 or 10 is Shabbos, I could fulfill the mitzvah without transgressing the Aveira, so I got to do that. Masha'en kain, when Shabbos is the 8th day, since there's a special mitzvah of doing a bris on the 8th day, I wouldn't be able to do that mitzvah without desecrating Shabbos. So I apply the rule, once again, of aseh docha lo sasa. Now, there is a requirement that this only applies that if the mitzvah is doing the Avera, but not the preparation. So, for example, a Moel would not be allowed to drive to do a Shabbos bris. Why is that? Because driving is not the mitzvah. Driving is only a preliminary to a mitzvah. So the rule that the positive mitzvah sets aside the sin is only the actual mitzvah itself and not the preliminaries. This is the shita of Rabbi Akiva that we paskin like. There actually is another view. There is a dat yachid of Rabbi Eliezer, who actually says by a bris, it's not only the bris that overrides Shabbos, but all of the preparations. The machshirei mila. He even gives a very extreme example. He says, you're allowed to cut down a tree to make a fire, to burnish your knife, to be able to do a bris, to kind of, heat your blade up, sterilize your blade. He says, all of that is nichlal in a mila being docha Shabbos, which means, according to him, a moel for sure could drive. So like Rabbi Eliezer, that would be true, but don't walk away thinking that. The halacha is absolutely clear that we follow, as we normally do, Rabbi Akiva's view, that it's only the mitzvah that sets aside the lo tasa, not the machshirim, not the preliminary activities. Now, why is it so that a positive overrides a negative? I mean, maybe I should say I should have a standoff. I don't know, and therefore don't do anything. So the Ramban in Parshas Yisro on Chumash gives a very beautiful explanation. He says that mitzvot aseh represent expressions of love. When I love someone, I do things for them. Lo saseh, don't touch that, represents the midah of fear and awe. Right? When I'm afraid, I don't dare, don't touch the air conditioner, whatever it would be. So the Ramban says, since the shoresh, the root of positive commandments is avas Hashem, and the root of negative commandments is yirat Hashem, ava is a higher madrega than yira, and that's why the ava trumps the yira in case of conflict. You need both. You do need both. In fact, yirat Hashem is foundational. And therefore, the same way you cannot build a second story until you have a first story. And you can't build a first story unless you have a foundation. So one cannot jump to Ava without Yira. If you do that, you're treating God like your buddy, and like in fact, a person once told me this. It was interesting. A person was telling me that they very much believe in Hashem, but they don't do mitzvahs. And we were talking why. I wasn't trying to proselytize him, but he was just talking to me, and he said, I am so buddy with God. He said that I know that whatever I do is going to be okay because we're buddy. So this would be an example, I think, of allowing the Avat Hashem without a Yirat Hashem to kind of give you a free ticket, which is not emes. So it is a davar pashut that Yiras Hashem is foundational, but spiritually, loving God is a higher level than simply being fearful, and therefore the Ramban says that is why asay dochelos asay. Okay, so now let's go back to the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi asks the following question: why does the pasuk in Yoshua imply that they couldn't eat matzah until the 16th of Nisan? There is a mitzvah d'oraisa, even today, to eat matzah, leil seder, not during the day, but leil seder. And if there's no other grain that qualifies as yashan, so there's no way, in a regular year, I would tell a person, hey, you're not allowed to eat chadash, get yashan. But in this case, there is no yashan. There's no other way I could do the mitzvah other than doing the Aveira of Chadash. So in such a situation, what should the halacha be? The positive mitzvah of matzah, be'erev tochlu matzot. The positive mitzvah of matzah should be doche. Right? The lo sasa, lechem, koli, v'karmel, lo sochlu. That's the lo sasa of Chadash, if you look in Parshat Emor. Right? So the Yerushalmi asks the kasha, why don't I apply the rule of, or why didn't I apply the rule of asay doche leisas? This is the Yerushalmi. The Bibli does not ask the question, but Tosos in Kedushin brings it. I actually have to say that because if I simply say the Yerushalmi, you might think I'm a Baki in Yerushalmi. So it's brought down that if you know the Yerushalmi from a secondary source, it's appropriate to say the secondary source. But Tosos and Kedushin brings this kasha of the Yerushalmi, and Tosos brings both answers. The Yerushalmi gives two terutzim to this question. The first is a technical answer, and that is the rule that the positive overrides the negative only applies to the mitzvos that were given at Har Sinai and afterwards, meaning from Matan Torah onwards. There's a special chashivas. But the mitzvot that were given prior to Matan Torah have less of a strength, and since the mitzvah of matzah was given prior to Matan Torah, Kodem Hadibor, it does not have the koach to be doche CHODOSH. Now, you could ask a very simple kasha. That's correct. You can ask a very simple kasha on the Talmud Yerushalmi. Bris Milah was given to Avram Avinu. But the answer was it was also repeated at Har Sinai. But then the question is, well, so was matzah. Because matzah was given in Mitzrayim, but matzah is repeated in Sefer Devarim. So l'chaira, matzah is in the same boat as Brit Milah, originally given before Har Sinai, and then repeated after Har Sinai. So if Brit Milah can override Shabbos, then we're back to square one. Why can't matzah override Chadash? It's a very good kasha on the Yerushalmi. And then the Yerushalmi gives another answer, and that is the following. Let's assume we would have said that you are allowed to eat the matzah. Okay, let's assume we would go with asay docha lo sasa. How much would you be allowed to eat? Remember, the mitzvah overrides the Yisur of Chadash. As soon as you fulfill the mitzvah, you got to stop because you're no longer covered. Well, how much matzah do you have to eat to fulfill the mitzvah da'oraisa? So it's only what's called a kizayat. Now, kizayat literally means the size of an olive. Now, as you know, massive controversy. Have the olives grown bigger? The truth of the matter is some of the amount of matzah that people eat at kizayas, this presupposes the kizayas was the size of a watermelon. And that, I can assure you, maybe the Meraglim brought back something like that. But other than the Meraglim bringing it back, there was no time that kizasim were the size that we make it, and the like. So whatever it would be, a kizayas is an olive, and even if you want to be machmir, it would be an egg. Even to assume it's an egg would be a huge thing, but okay, there's a makam to be based on Talmudic sources that you might go as high as an egg, the volume of an egg. That would mean the amount of matzah that you would crush and fill something that has the volume of an egg, including the shell, whatever that would be. Whatever your kazayas is. And by the way, I always want to point out that, it's interesting that the most mekil shiurim of kazayas and everything, all the shiurim, were compiled by, again, a Chabad chassid who was a great posek in Yerushalayim, accepted by everybody, Rav Avram Chaim Noah. So even if whenever you see shiurim lists, and it'll give you small, medium, large, the small is always based on Avram Chaim Noah, who died, I think, maybe in the 1930s or 40s. And then the largest shiurim are, of course, Chazanish shiurim, who made pretty huge shiurim. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach once remarked, when Rav Avram Chaim Noah's Sefer came out in the 1920s, everybody in Yerushalayim were saying, why is he so machmer on the shiurim? Meaning, what in our world is treated as the smallest, most lenient shiur, Rav Shlomo Zalman said, that was a chumrah. That was a great chumrah already. People were saying, what is he so machmer about? And the emissaries, they say, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, the great Talmud of the Gra, when he would show people at his Seder what was a kazayas, he said, the amount of matzah that covers your palm is a kazayas of matzah. Which, is, if you crush it up, it's close to a large olive. That basically, there was no chachmas there. He basically said, kazayas is a kazayas. So I'm not here to resolve that. Maybe sometime we'll give a longer share on it. But the point of the Yerushalmi is the following. Whatever heter you have to eat chadash because of asay docha lotasa will only apply to a kazayas. Anything over and above a kazayas is a losasa which is not covered by an asay. And if that's the case, it would be an aveira. Therefore, there was a rabbinic decree: do not eat the first kazayat, lest you come to eat more than is covered. So you see two interesting things with this. First of all, you see the interesting chronological point that such a rabbinic decree existed already in the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Meaning, it's a pretty early rabbinic decree to say the Jews who crossed the Ardain didn't eat the Chadash because of the Gezerah of Kazayat Rishon, because of Kazayat Sheni. So that's one interesting thing, that some rabbinic decrees can be quite early. The second thing that you see is, which is not, you see in other places as well, that a rabbinic decree can prevent you from fulfilling a Torah commandment. There is a Torah commandment to eat matzah, but because of the rabbinic decree that you might eat too much, they said don't do it. Now, you obviously can think right away, we have other cases like this. We don't blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, lest you carry the shofar in a public domain. So the rabbis were afraid of really a 1 in 1,000 problem. We have Arabs and everything else. And yet the Rabbanan took away the mitzvah of blowing the shofar. And don't give me the answer, well, we always have it because we have the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Well, no, we don't. The second day of Rosh Hashanah is a rabbinic Yom Tov. It is not a Torah Yom Tov. So when the rabbis say you don't blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, you are losing a very precious mitzvah d'oraisa. You see? So once again, this is a well-known idea that in order to prevent violation of the Torah, the Chachamim can actually abrogate a positive commandment. They did it by shofar, and according to the Yerushalmi, they did it at the first Pesach by saying, don't eat the first kazayat, lest you come to eat the second kazayat. Yeah.
We can't distinguish between low tasas and low tasas. You can't steal to do a bris. You can't kill someone to do a bris.
Yep. Yeah. So the simplest answer would be is that all of those are preliminaries, meaning to steal to do a bris would be similar to drive to do a bris. So I can give you a technical answer for that as well. But once again, I'll leave you with a thought question to think about, because there are two principles that seem to be contradictory principles. Principle one is the positive mitzvah overrides the sin. That's called asay docha lo saseh. Principle number two, and I think this is really implicit in your question, is there's another principle called mitzvah haba ba'avera. Any mitzvah that you accomplish by the commission of a sin is not only a sin, but you don't get the mitzvah. Now, think about that. They actually are proceeding on opposite premises. One says the mitzvah overrides the sin. The other says the mitzvah is tainted by the sin, and that invalidates the mitzvah. So really, the question you're ultimately asking is, when do we apply the rule that the mitzvah overrides the sin, called asay docha lo taseh, and when do we apply the rule mitzvah ba b'avera? You're 100% correct. If you steal a lulav, the Mishnah says explicitly that not only are you a thief, but you don't even get the mitzvah. Mitzvah ba b'avera. So once again, the technical answer might be that most of the cases of mitzvah ba'avera is the avera was done as a preliminary to doing the mitzvah. So
that has nothing to do with the mitzvah.
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with the mitzvah.
Right, which is not directly connected to the mitzvah. So most of the cases there are technical answers, but there are going to be times in which,
Isn't it? It's surprising. Apparently, it is not the case that you don't say mitzvah say dochen lo saseh when you're still able to perform the mitzvah afterwards.
That's for sure. Yeah, because that's another rule. That's because you're able to do both. So certainly, I mean that's pashut. If I steal a lulav when I didn't have to steal one, for sure. But even where it's unavoidable, so you don't have that heter, the Mishnah still says you're not judged.
But you performed the mitzvah of bris milah on day 9 too.
You performed the mitzvah, but you could have avoided, since you could have avoided the conflict.
No.
I mean, you're asking me, is the bris kosher? You mean?
Yeah. No. What I'm saying is, if it would be one thing if the only time you could be mekayim the mitzvah of bris was b'yom hashmini.
Yes.
And then if it came on Shabbos, you'd say mitzvah.
Okay, and I understand. Yeah. So the answer to that is that bris milah has two mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of bris milah, but there's a mitzvah of bayom hashmini yimol b'sorah laseh. Now that's a special mitzvah. So the mitzvah bayom hashmini yimol b'sorah laseh can only be done on the 8th day. So that particular mitzvah is not doable at a later time. Let me give you one example where the Gemara itself, the Bavli, uses the gezerah, don't do what you're allowed to do lest you do more. It actually uses it by Yibam. Very, very interesting. The mitzvah of Yibam, of course, is a mitzvah that says if a man dies without children, there's a mitzvah on his brother to marry the widow, to perpetuate the seed, etc. So imagine the following halacha. Let's imagine that he's a Kohen, a man is a Kohen, and his brother is actually not a Kohen. It's interesting. You may ask, how can I be a Kohen, my brother not be a Kohen? The answer would be because my father had 2 wives, and one wife was a divorced woman, and therefore a Kohen who marries a divorced woman, the kid is not a Kohen, and I'm from the wife that's not divorced, so I am a Kohen. So my brother is not a Kohen. My brother marries a divorced woman, which he's allowed to do. The brother then dies without children. So the woman who falls liyibam to the Kohen is a divorced woman. For a Kohen to marry a divorced woman is a negative commandment. D'oraisa, the Gemara says, the Kohen is allowed to do yibam on a divorced woman because aseh, the positive mitzvah of yibam, is docha, overrides the lo sasa. But he would have to divorce her immediately. He wouldn't be allowed to be with her a second time because the mitzvah of yibam is the initial consummation. So the Rabbanan made a takana that he's not allowed to be with her once, lest he be with her twice, and therefore the takana is he must give chalitza rather than yibam, even though doraisa yibam would be permitted, but this is a gezerah, bia rishona to be a shnia, and the Yerushalmi is applying the same paradigm, gezerah kezayis rishon atu kezayis sheni. Okay, so this is just a little bit about Chodosh and Yashan, and next week we'll talk about another grain offering of Shavuos, the Shtei HaLechem, the 2 wheat breads, and what that represents. Okay, have a good week.